The humid Pennsylvania air hung heavy with tension as Samuel Wilkson of the New York Tribune adjusted his spectacles and surveyed the rolling hills surrounding the small town of Gettysburg. It was the evening of June 30th, 1863, and something extraordinary was brewing in this sleepy farming community. Telegraph wires buzzed with fragmentary reports of Confederate forces moving through the Cumberland Valley, while Union cavalry under General John Buford had taken positions along the ridges west of town. Wilkson was not alone in recognizing the significance of the moment. Alongside him, a small but determined corps of war correspondents had converged on Gettysburg, drawn by whispers of an impending confrontation that could determine the fate of the Union. These men, Charles Carlton Coffin of the Boston Journal, Whitelaw Reid of the Cincinnati Gazette, and Lorenzo Krauntz of the New York Times, represented a new breed of journalist, one that had emerged from the crucible of civil war to bring the reality of battle directly to the American people. The profession of war correspondents had evolved dramatically since the conflict began 2 years earlier. Initially, newspaper coverage relied heavily on official dispatches and second-hand accounts from officers and soldiers. But as the war dragged on and public appetite for news grew insatiable, editors dispatched their most capable reporters to follow the armies and witness events firsthand. These correspondents faced unique challenges: military censorship, dangerous conditions, and the constant pressure to file stories quickly while maintaining accuracy. As Wilkson walked through Gettysburg's streets that evening, he observed the subtle signs of approaching conflict. Civilians hurried about their business with nervous energy, while small groups of Union cavalry watered their horses at local wells. The correspondent made careful notes, understanding that these seemingly mundane details would prove crucial in painting a complete picture for his readers back in New York. The war correspondents had learned to read the landscape of approaching battle: dust clouds on distant roads, the positioning of artillery pieces, the tempo of military movements, all told a story to trained eyes. Coffin, a veteran of numerous engagements, had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when significant action was imminent. His reports from Antietam and Fredericksburg had earned him recognition as one of the most reliable voices covering the Army of the Potomac. Reid, younger but equally ambitious, had established himself through his coverage of Western theater operations. His presence at Gettysburg represented the growing recognition that this battle might eclipse all previous engagements in scope and importance. The Cincinnati Gazette had invested heavily in war coverage, understanding that their readers craved detailed, immediate accounts of military developments. As darkness fell over Gettysburg, the correspondents established their temporary headquarters in the town's hotels and boarding houses. They checked their equipment: portable writing desks, telegraph forms, field glasses, and the precious notebooks that would preserve their observations for posterity. Each man understood that they were not merely observers, but witnesses to history, charged with conveying the human drama of war to a nation anxiously following every development. The evening brought disturbing intelligence from local residents and Union scouts. Confederate forces under General Robert Lee were concentrating in the area, with multiple corps converging on the crossroads town. General George Meade's Army of the Potomac was responding, but the race to position forces advantageously had begun. Wilkson and his colleagues sensed that the morning would bring more than routine skirmishing. They stood on the threshold of witnessing the war's most decisive engagement. Dawn broke gray and ominous over Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863, as the sharp crack of rifle fire shattered the morning calm. Samuel Wilkson jolted awake in his cramped hotel room, immediately recognizing the distinctive sound of serious combat. Within minutes, he and his fellow correspondents were dressed and moving toward the source of the gunfire, notebooks and field glasses in hand. The battle had begun almost by accident, as Confederate forces under General Henry Heth encountered Union cavalry vedettes west of town. What started as a reconnaissance in force quickly escalated as both sides fed additional troops into the engagement. Charles Carlton Coffin positioned himself on Seminary Ridge, where he could observe the developing action while remaining relatively safe from direct fire. From his vantage point, Coffin watched as blue-clad cavalry fought desperately to delay the advancing Confederate infantry. General John Buford's troopers, armed with breech-loading carbines, delivered a withering fire that temporarily halted Heth's advance. The correspondent scribbled rapid notes, capturing the drama of dismounted cavalry fighting as infantry, while their horses waited in protected positions behind the ridge line. As the morning progressed, the sound of battle intensified. Union General John Reynolds arrived with the First Corps, immediately recognizing the tactical importance of holding the high ground south of Gettysburg. Coffin watched in fascination as Reynolds deployed his troops with practiced efficiency, transforming a cavalry delaying action into a proper infantry engagement. The correspondent noted the general's calm demeanor under fire, unaware that he was witnessing Reynolds's final moments. Whitelaw Reid had taken a different approach to covering the unfolding battle. Rather than seeking a single observation point, he moved constantly between different positions, gathering information from officers, soldiers, and civilians caught in the fighting. This technique, which he had perfected during his coverage of Western campaigns, allowed him to construct a more complete narrative of events as they unfolded. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the National Archives, Reid's methodology represented a significant advancement in battlefield journalism. Unlike earlier correspondents who often relied on post-battle interviews and official reports, Reid insisted on witnessing events firsthand, even when this placed him in considerable danger. The arrival of Confederate General Robert Ewell's II Corps from the North fundamentally changed the character of the engagement. Union forces, already stretched thin by fighting on two fronts, began to show signs of strain. Lorenzo Crounce of the New York Times positioned himself near the town cemetery, where he could observe the developing crisis as Union troops found themselves caught between converging Confederate forces. Crounce's dispatches would later reveal the confusion and heroism of those crucial afternoon hours. He witnessed regiments dissolving under pressure, officers attempting to rally broken units, and the gradual collapse of the Union position north and west of Gettysburg. His trained eye caught details that would prove crucial to understanding the battle's flow. The precise timing of Confederate attacks, the identification of specific units involved, and the decision-making process that led Union forces to abandon their forward positions. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the correspondents faced their first major challenge: how to file their stories while the battle continued to rage around them. Telegraph lines to major cities remained open, but reaching the telegraph office required navigating streets swept by rifle fire and artillery shells. Wilson made the dangerous journey first, sending a brief dispatch to the New York Tribune, confirming that a major engagement was developing at Gettysburg. The retreat of Union forces through Gettysburg streets provided dramatic material for the correspondents' stories. They witnessed the controlled withdrawal transform into something approaching a rout as Confederate pressure intensified. Yet they also observed acts of remarkable courage: rearguard units fighting desperately to cover their comrades' retreat, officers exposing themselves to rally their men, and the gradual establishment of defensive positions on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, south of town. By evening, as the guns finally fell silent, the correspondents took stock of the day's events. The Union Army had suffered a tactical defeat, losing thousands of casualties and yielding the town itself to Confederate forces. Yet the position they now occupied on the high ground south of Gettysburg appeared formidable, and reinforcements were arriving throughout the night. The pre-dawn hours of July 2nd, 1863, found the war correspondents huddled around flickering candles in various farmhouses and barns scattered across the Union-held hills south of Gettysburg. Samuel Wilson had spent the night interviewing wounded soldiers and junior officers, piecing together a clearer picture of the previous day's fighting for his Tribune readers. The stories he gathered painted a sobering portrait of men pushed to their limits yet determined to hold their ground. As the sun rose, revealing the full scope of both armies' positions, the correspondents began to grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding. Confederate forces occupied the town of Gettysburg and the ridgelines to the west, while Union troops held a fishhook-shaped defensive line stretching from Culp's Hill in the north to Little Round Top in the south. Between these opposing forces lay nearly a mile of open ground that would soon become a killing field. Charles Carleton Coffin established his observation post near the Union signal station on Little Round Top, where he could survey the entire battlefield through his field glasses. From this elevated position, he watched as both armies continued to arrive and deploy throughout the morning. Confederate General James Longstreet's 1st Corps was taking position opposite the Union left flank, while General Richard Ewell's forces faced the Union right wing from their positions in and around Gettysburg. The correspondent noted the methodical preparation for battle: artillery batteries unlimbering and positioning their guns, infantry regiments forming battle lines behind protective ridges, and the constant movement of supply wagons and ammunition carts. Coffin understood that he was witnessing the careful choreography that preceded large-scale combat, a deadly dance performed by veterans who knew their trade intimately. Whitelaw Reid had spent the early morning hours at Union headquarters where he managed to observe General George Meade's decision-making process firsthand. The new commander of the Army of the Potomac, in position for less than a week, faced the enormous challenge of fighting a defensive battle on ground he had not chosen. Reid watched Meade study his maps, consult with his corps commanders, and issue the orders that would determine the fate of his army. The Cincinnati Gazette correspondent noted Meade's calm professionalism under pressure, contrasting sharply with the political generals who had previously commanded Union forces. "This was a soldier's soldier," Reid observed, "a man who understood the brutal mathematics of battlefield tactics and the importance of maintaining interior lines of communication and supply." As the morning progressed, it became clear that Robert Lee intended to attack the Union flanks rather than assault the strong center position on Cemetery Ridge. Lorenzo Crowns positioned himself where he could observe the Confederate preparations along Seminary Ridge, noting the concentration of artillery and the positioning of assault troops. His experience covering previous battles allowed him to read the tactical signs that indicated Lee's intentions. The afternoon brought the war correspondents their most challenging assignment yet, covering simultaneous attacks on both ends of the Union line. General Daniel Sickles' unauthorized advance from the main Union position created a crisis that drew Reid and Coffin toward the Peach Orchard and Wheatfield, where savage fighting erupted as Longstreet's corps struck the exposed 3rd Corps. Coffin's account of the fighting in the Wheatfield would become one of the most vivid pieces of combat journalism produced during the entire war. As referenced in Bruce Catton's Glory Road, he described the ebb and flow of battle as regiments charged and countercharged across the blood-soaked field, with ownership of the position changing hands multiple times within a single hour. His prose captured both the tactical complexity of the engagement and its human cost. Meanwhile, Croontz found himself drawn to the dramatic struggle for Little Round Top, where Union Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's 20th Maine Infantry made their famous stand against Confederate forces attempting to turn the Union left flank. The correspondent witnessed the crucial moment when Chamberlain ordered his men to fix bayonets and charge downhill, breaking the Confederate assault just as his regiment's ammunition ran low. As evening approached and the guns gradually fell silent, the correspondents faced the daunting task of synthesizing the day's events into coherent narratives for their readers. The fighting had been more intense and widespread than the previous day, with casualties mounting on both sides. Yet the Union line had held, despite several moments when breakthrough seemed imminent. Wilson spent the evening hours moving between field hospitals, documenting the human cost of the day's fighting. His interviews with wounded soldiers and exhausted surgeons provided material for dispatches that would bring the reality of war directly into American homes. The sultry morning of July 3, 1863, dawned with an eerie quiet that made the war correspondents instinctively nervous. After 2 days of escalating violence, the sudden calm felt ominous rather than peaceful. Samuel Wilson positioned himself near the Union Artillery Park on Cemetery Ridge, where Captain John Hazard's batteries waited in grim anticipation of what most officers believed would be Lee's final decisive assault. Wilson had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded major attacks. The unusual quiet from Confederate positions, the concentration of enemy artillery along Seminary Ridge, and the nervous energy among Union troops all pointed toward an impending storm. As he interviewed battery commanders and infantry officers, a consistent theme emerged. Everyone expected the Confederates to attack the Union center, the strongest part of Meade's defensive line. Charles Carleton Coffin had established his observation post near the copse of trees, the small grove of oak and chestnut trees that mark the center of the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. From this vantage point, He could observe both the Confederate preparations across the valley and the Union defensive arrangements. His trained eye noted details that would prove crucial to his later reporting: the precise positioning of artillery batteries, the deployment of infantry regiments behind stone walls, and the careful coordination between different units. The Boston Journal correspondent understood that he was witnessing the preparation for what might be the war's decisive moment. His dispatches from previous battles had earned him a reputation for accuracy and vivid description, qualities that would serve him well in covering what promised to be an unprecedented artillery bombardment, followed by a massive infantry assault. Approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Confederate artillery erupted in what would later be remembered as the greatest cannonade in the history of the Western Hemisphere. 150 Confederate guns opened fire simultaneously, creating a thunderous roar that could be heard 30 miles away. Whitelaw Reid, caught in the open when the bombardment began, dove for cover behind a stone wall and found himself sharing shelter with soldiers from the Second Corps. Reid's account of the artillery barrage would become one of the most powerful pieces of combat journalism ever written. He described the physical sensation of being under heavy bombardment, the earth shaking with each explosion, the acrid smoke that burned eyes and throat, the screams of wounded men and horses, and the metallic taste of fear that filled every mouth. His prose captured not just the tactical details of the engagement, but its psychological impact on the men who endured it. Lorenzo Krauntz had positioned himself near General Winfield Scott Hancock's headquarters, where he could observe the Union response to the Confederate bombardment. He watched as Union Artillery Chief Henry Hunt made the calculated decision to gradually reduce return fire, conserving ammunition for the infantry assault that would inevitably follow. Krauntz noted Hancock's calm leadership under fire, the general's presence serving as a steadying influence on his troops. As the cannonade continued for nearly 2 hours, the correspondents documented its effects on both armies. Confederate artillery, firing at maximum range, proved less accurate than hoped, with many shots passing over the Union line to explode harmlessly in the rear areas. However, the psychological impact was enormous, testing the nerve of veteran troops who had never experienced such concentrated firepower. When the Confederate guns finally fell silent, an unnatural quiet settled over the battlefield. Through the drifting smoke, the correspondents could see masses of Confederate infantry emerging from the woods along Seminary Ridge. General George Pickett's division, supported by troops from Hill's and Ewell's Corps, began their advance across the mile of open ground separating the two armies. Coffin watched in fascination as approximately 15,000 Confederate soldiers dressed their lines and began their march toward the Union center. He noted the precision of their movement, the way sunlight glinted off their bayonets, and the battle flags that marked each regiment's position. This was warfare, as it had been practiced for centuries, massed infantry advancing in formation against prepared defensive positions. The Union response was devastating and immediate. Artillery batteries that had remained silent during the bombardment opened fire with canister and case shot, tearing great holes in the advancing Confederate ranks. Infantry regiments behind stone walls delivered volleys at close range, while additional Union forces moved to reinforce the threatened sector. Wilkeson found himself in the midst of the action as Confederate troops breached the Union line near the copse of trees. He witnessed hand-to-hand combat between men who had marched 1,000 miles to reach this moment of decision. His notebook captured the climactic moment when Confederate General Lewis Armistead fell mortally wounded just feet from Union cannon, marking the high water mark of the Confederate assault. As the surviving Confederate troops began their retreat across the bloody field, the correspondents understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Pickett's charge, as it would later be known, represented not just a tactical defeat, but a strategic turning point in the war. The Army of Northern Virginia had suffered irreplaceable losses in its failed attempt to break the Union center. The smoke-filled dawn of July 4th, 1863, revealed a battlefield transformed by 3 days of unprecedented carnage. Samuel Wilkeson stood among the debris of war scattered across Cemetery Ridge, his notebook already filled with observations that would become some of the most powerful battlefield journalism ever written. Around him lay the detritus of Pickett's charge, abandoned muskets, torn battle flags, and the still forms of men who had advanced into history the previous afternoon. Wilkeson faced a personal tragedy that would profoundly influence his reporting. His son, Lieutenant Bayard Wilkeson, had been mortally wounded on July 1st while serving with a Union artillery battery. The correspondent had spent the night of July 3rd at his son's deathbed, an experience that would infuse his dispatches with a profound understanding of war's human cost. His account of finding his dying son among the wounded would become one of the most moving pieces of war correspondence ever published. Charles Carleton Coffin began his post-battle reporting by attempting to quantify the enormous casualties suffered by both armies. His methodical approach involved visiting field hospitals, interviewing medical officers, and carefully documenting the losses sustained by individual regiments. The scale of suffering was unprecedented, over 50,000 total casualties in 3 days of fighting. The Boston Journal correspondent's training as a surveyor proved invaluable as he mapped the battlefield, identifying the locations of key engagements and documenting the positions where specific units had fought and died. His precise geographical descriptions would later prove crucial for historians attempting to understand the battle's tactical development. Whitelaw Reid focused his attention on the Confederate retreat, which began during the rainy night of July 4th. Lee's army, having suffered catastrophic losses, was attempting to withdraw to Virginia while still maintaining some semblance of military organization. Reid followed the retreating columns, interviewing Confederate prisoners and observing the demoralized condition of troops who had previously seemed invincible. The Cincinnati Gazette correspondent noted the contrast between the confident army that had invaded Pennsylvania 3 weeks earlier and the battered force now struggling to escape Union pursuit. His dispatches captured the human drama of retreat. Wounded men abandoned by the roadside, supply wagons bogged down in mud, and the gradual dissolution of military discipline as exhausted soldiers focused solely on survival. Lorenzo Crounse concentrated on the Union Army's response to victory, documenting General Meade's cautious pursuit of Lee's retreating forces. The New York Times correspondent interviewed corps and division commanders, seeking to understand why the Army of the Potomac had not launched an immediate pursuit that might have destroyed Lee's army entirely. The answers he received revealed the complex calculations that military commanders must make in the aftermath of major battles. According to James McPherson's comprehensive study, Battle Cry of Freedom, the correspondent's immediate post-battle reporting played a crucial role in shaping public understanding of Gettysburg's significance. Their dispatches, filed via telegraph to major newspapers across the North, provided the first detailed accounts of the engagement that would define it as the war's turning point. The correspondents also documented the beginning of what would become a sacred pilgrimage site. Even before the armies had departed, civilians from surrounding communities began arriving to search for relatives and to witness the battlefield where American history had been written in blood. Coffin noted the solemn processions of families seeking their dead, the careful marking of graves by comrades, and the beginning of efforts to preserve significant locations. Wilkeson's most challenging assignment came when he was asked to describe the battlefield's appearance after 3 days of fighting. His prose captured the apocalyptic landscape: trees stripped of leaves by rifle fire, fields churned into mud by artillery wheels and marching feet, and the overwhelming smell of death that hung over the entire area. His descriptions would later influence how Americans visualize the cost of preserving the Union. The correspondents also began interviewing local civilians who had experienced the battle firsthand. These accounts provided a different perspective on the fighting, revealing how the conflict had affected non-combatants caught in the path of two massive armies. Stories of families hiding in cellars during bombardments, of homes transformed into hospitals, and of entire communities disrupted by war added depth to the correspondents' coverage. As the week progressed and the immediate aftermath of battle gave way to reflection, the correspondents began to assess Gettysburg's strategic significance. Reid's analysis proved particularly prescient, as he argued that Lee's defeat represented a fundamental shift in the war's momentum. The Army of Northern Virginia, while still formidable, had lost its aura of invincibility and would never again possess the strength to threaten Northern territory. The correspondents also documented the beginning of efforts to care for the enormous number of wounded soldiers left behind by both armies. Gettysburg's small population was overwhelmed by thousands of casualties requiring medical attention, leading to an unprecedented mobilization of civilian resources. Churches, schools, and private homes were converted into hospitals, while nurses and doctors arrived from across the North to assist with medical care. The days following the Battle of Gettysburg presented the war correspondents with their greatest challenge yet, transforming 3 days of chaos, heroism, and horror into coherent narratives that would help a nation understand the magnitude of what had occurred. Samuel Wilson, still reeling from his personal loss, poured his grief and his professional expertise into dispatches that would define how Americans remembered the battle for generations to come. Wilson's most famous dispatch, filed on July 4, 1863, began with the haunting words that would become synonymous with Gettysburg itself. Who can write the history of a battle whose eyes are immovably fastened upon a central figure of transcendingly absorbing interest, the dead body of an oldest born, crushed by a shell in a position where a battery should never have been sent, and abandoned to death in a building where surgeons dared not to stay? This deeply personal opening transformed battlefield reporting from mere tactical description into profound human testimony. Charles Carlton Coffin approached his post-battle reporting with characteristic methodical precision. He spent 2 weeks in the Gettysburg area, systematically interviewing participants from both armies and carefully documenting the sequence of events that had led to Lee's defeat. His series of articles for the Boston Journal would later serve as primary source material for historians studying the battle's tactical development. Coffin's innovation lay in his recognition that the battle's significance extended beyond its immediate military consequences. He documented the transformation of Gettysburg from an obscure Pennsylvania crossroads into a symbol of national significance. His interviews with local residents revealed how the community was already beginning to grasp that their town would forever be associated with the struggle to preserve the Union. Whitelaw Reid's coverage for the Cincinnati Gazette focused on the political implications of the Union victory. His analysis of the battle's impact on Northern morale and Confederate capabilities proved remarkably prescient. Reid argued that Gettysburg represented not just a tactical victory, but a strategic turning point that would ultimately lead to Union triumph. His assessment of the battle's significance would be vindicated by subsequent events. Reid also pioneered what would later be called human interest reporting by focusing on individual stories of courage and sacrifice. His account of Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's defense of Little Round Top, based on extensive interviews with survivors of the 20th Maine Infantry, helped establish one of the battle's most enduring heroic narratives. These personal stories gave readers a way to connect emotionally with events that might otherwise seem too large to comprehend. Lorenzo Krauntz's reporting for the New York Times emphasized the battle's cost in human terms. His careful documentation of casualty figures based on official reports and personal observation provided readers with the most accurate contemporary assessment of the battle's toll. Krauntz's work established the template for modern war reporting's emphasis on precise, factual coverage of military operations. The Correspondent also documented the beginning of efforts to commemorate the battle and honor its dead. His coverage of the early discussions about establishing a national cemetery at Gettysburg would prove prophetic, as these initial conversations would eventually lead to President Abraham Lincoln's famous address dedicating the cemetery in November 1863. The Correspondents' collective work created the first comprehensive record of the Battle of Gettysburg, establishing many of the narratives and interpretations that continue to shape public understanding of the engagement. Their reports, filed under dangerous conditions and published while the outcome of the war remained uncertain, provided Americans with immediate access to one of their history's most significant events. As noted in J. Matthew Gallman's The Battle of Gettysburg, A Guided Tour, the war correspondents' reporting established Gettysburg as the Civil War's defining battle in the public imagination. Their vivid descriptions of the fighting, their analysis of its strategic significance, and their documentation of individual acts of heroism created a narrative framework that has endured for more than a century and a half. The Correspondents also established important precedents for future war reporting. Their insistence on first-hand observation, their commitment to interviewing participants from all levels of military hierarchy, and their recognition that battles have both tactical and symbolic significance would influence how later conflicts were covered by the press. In the weeks following the battle, as the correspondents returned to their home offices and began preparing longer retrospective pieces, they reflected on what they had witnessed. All four men understood that they had been present at a pivotal moment in American history. Their reporting had not merely documented events, but had helped shape how the nation understood the meaning of the sacrifice made at Gettysburg. The legacy of their work extends far beyond the immediate wartime period. Their dispatches and longer articles became source material for historians. Their narrative techniques influenced the development of American journalism, and their recognition of Gettysburg's symbolic importance helped establish the battle's place in national memory. Through their words, Americans then and now could comprehend both the tactical brilliance and human cost of the engagement that decided the fate of the Union.